Hello, everybody. I'm just setting up all the settings and I will keep admitting you. There we are. All right, we've got the majority of you in the virtual room. So firstly, thank you for joining us on Zoom tonight for a discussion of this wonderful book, 10,000 Aftershocks by Michelle Tom. We were literally just chatting before and I was saying that this is one of my favorite book covers of the year so far in its striking minimalism. Before we do jump into things, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, which I'm currently on in Meanjin, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the land from which you're all joining us from on Zoom tonight. We've got James joining us from Dubbo and Michelle's joining us from Melbourne. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For everyone in our audience, you will be on mute, but if you have any questions, you'll be able to address them to me in the chat box. You're also welcome to leave your video on if you'd like. Just make sure you're set to speaker view in the corner. So where it says view, that little button in the top right corner, if you have it on speaker view, you'll be able to see Michelle and James in full screen. I'm just about to send you through a link where you can purchase your copy of the book into the chat box, and that will show you how you can use the chat box as well. And that will be very important for our little Q&A session towards the end at about 7:15 or 7:20, depending how we're going for time. But please feel free to type through your questions throughout the event as they pop into your head, and then I'll try my best to pass them along towards the end. So next, I'd like to introduce you to our conversation partner for tonight, James McKenzie Watson. James won the 2021 Penguin Literary Prize for his novel Denizen, which also received the 2021 Varuna Residential Fellowship, a 2021 KSP Fellowship, and was highly commended for the 2020 Writing New South Wales Varuna Fellowships. His short fiction has been recognised in competitions, including the International Ink Tears Flash Fiction Contest and the Grieve Writing Competition. He co-hosts the Writing and Health podcast, James and Ashley Stay at Home, and works as a critical care nurse in regional New South Wales. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jana and Avid, for hosting this conversation. Thank you so much, Michelle, for asking me to take part in this with you. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to chat to you again. As Jana said, I co-host a Writing and Health podcast with fellow writer Ashley Clayton-Blunt, who I believe is here tonight. Hello, Ashley. Called James and Ashley Stay at Home, in which we interview a wide variety of Australian and international authors. Because of this, I'm lucky enough to get home every other day and find a new book from a publisher on my doorstep. Every now and again, I get a book that shakes me awake and reminds me why I both read and write, and 10,000 Aftershocks was one of those books. As a writer, I spent most of the time I was reading it thinking, far out, I wish I had thought of that. I recommended it to so many people and had to buy them their own copies because I want my copy close for when I'm editing my book. As a reader, I was floored by this haunting, searing, deeply affecting page turner. 10,000 Aftershocks is a masterclass, not just of memoir, but of storytelling in general, and in particular of the power of structure as a narrative device. And I hope we'll get a chance to chat about that tonight. Ashley and I recorded our interview with Michelle about 2 weeks before her book came out, which was September 1st. I think the book came out, so we recorded the interview in the middle of August. And it's been such a joy to watch it enter the world and find its audience and get the kind of rave response that I knew it would from about 2 pages in. 10,000 Aftershocks has been out in the world for 6 weeks now, and it's such a delight to have the opportunity to talk to Michelle about it again. So Michelle, thank you again for inviting me and welcome.
Thank you, James. Before we get started, can I pay my respects to the people of the Boonwurrung land and the Kulin Nation? And can I say also kia ora koutou to any Kiwi friends that might be joining us tonight?
Michelle, for anyone here who's not familiar with your book, could you start by telling us what 10,000 Aftershocks is about?
Sure. It's about a lot of things. It's a very, it's a very broad book. It's 2 stories. It's a dual narrative. It's the story of my survival of the Christchurch earthquakes of 2010 and 11. And it's also the story of survival of a chaotic childhood It's told in the 5 stages of an earthquake, and it's also told using fragments. Yeah, that's probably the brief overview. It deals with themes of loss, grief, fight or flight, seeking safety, and estrangement. Yeah.
I'm glad you've touched on the structure there, the 5 stages of the earthquake, because I think most of the people that I've spoken to about your book, that's something that they identify as being one of the most striking and unique things about it. And it's certainly, I've never read a book structured like this. So as Michelle said, the book is split up into the 5 stages of an earthquake. You're gonna have to remind me what those 5 stages are. Remember that 1 is the very beginning, 5 is the shock, sorry, 4 is the shock itself, and 5 is the aftershock. I can't remember what 2 and 3 are though.
So 2 and 3 involve the movement of rock.
Yeah.
It's called diffusion, and it's when rocks break up under pressure to take up more room, which you would imagine would weaken the earth, but it actually strengthens it, because those broken parts sort of hold firm against each other. They create friction against each other with their rough surfaces, and fluid flows out of the fault at that point, and the rocks are dry and they're firm because they're holding, they're under pressure, and we know what's going to happen eventually, but at that point they're still holding. And then eventually the water in the surrounding soil rushes back into the fault, lubricates those rocks, and they start to move, and that's just before the earthquake happens. Yeah.
And it's obviously such a rich and powerful metaphor for a chaotic, disrupted childhood, and all the endless ramifications of that throughout your adult life.
Yeah, and the sort of waiting around for the next big blow up. When I was a kid, I used to measure how long it was between my parents' arguments, and I think it got down to it was 3 or 6 weeks, sort of on average. And when I read the stages of the earthquake, I thought, yeah, this is it. But it was about my sister's story. So my sister was the scapegoat of the family. She sort of bore the brunt of my parents' discomfort with each other, and to me the 5 stages of the earthquake were really her life in a nutshell. So things were okay for a bit, and then things started to go wrong, and then they really blew up, and then there were these ripple effects afterwards. So there was sort of layers and layers and layers of metaphor with this thing that just kept coming at me, and in the end it was kind of trying to just contain it all in this neat way, trying to contain it all in this neat way. Yeah.
One of the things that Ashley and I discussed with you when we interviewed you in August was what the response to the book had been like pre-publication. So at that point, it had only been seen by friends and family, people in the industry. This is such a deeply personal book about the most difficult and painful periods of your life. What's it been like? What's it been like having it out in the world since then, since we spoke?
Your message on Instagram was the first one, James, that from anyone outside that circle. And I was sitting on the couch one night, and you sent me a message saying, that I'd blown the top off your head or something, and and I thought, oh wow, this is really, because I've been sitting waiting on tenterhooks. How's it going to be received? Yes. And so that was really lovely. I have to say thank you for that, because you never know, I guess, when you're going to be the first person to let someone know how their book's going down. Since then, it's been overwhelmingly positive, I have to say. The reviews have been good. The feedback's been amazing. I've had some beautiful messages from people who haven't been through obviously the same journey as I have, but they have found parts of the story relevant to their own experiences, and that's been really touching. And to be honest, that was a big part of why I wrote the book. I wanted to reach out to people who were struggling with these kinds of difficult relationships. Maybe they're thinking about estrangement. Maybe they're thinking about going low contact and limiting that kind of exposure. And I wanted to reach out to those people, not to say that they should, do those things, but to say you're not on your own, and that there are lots of us out here struggling with this, these difficulties, and what to do about these people in our families that we can't quite come to terms with, we can't have a successful relationship with. It's costing us too much to remain in contact. So I just wanted, those were the people I wanted to reach, and it's been really lovely to get those messages, and people have been really I was warned early on, like, don't take on other people's baggage and emotional fallout and all the rest of it. But people, it's not been like that at all. People have just really been saying thank you for talking about this, and that's been really gratifying.
You've touched on one of the key themes of the book there, which is estrangement. It's funny, the first time I read the book pre-release, I didn't kind of identify that as being one of the really key important themes. But in the months since then, it's been particularly following you on social media and seeing people's responses to the book, and seeing messages people have sent you to the book, and seeing how often the theme of estrangement is pulled out by these people as being something that's really, really resonated with them. So in the book, I guess there's two estrangements. The book opens with the death of your sister Meredith from melanoma. And through this fragmented narrative, we see that you'd had a difficult relationship with long periods of estrangement, from adolescence up until her death, but also the relationship with your mother and the ongoing estrangement with her that continues now. And going back and rereading the book, preparing for this conversation, it stuck out at me a lot more, and I found I kind of appreciate the power and the difficulty in writing so honestly about this, because both of these decisions, these estrangements, were clearly immensely difficult and riddled with guilt, doubt, and grief. But they were decisions that you reached because you had no other choice, ultimately, for your own self-preservation and the preservation of those around you, your family, now your husband and children. And the way that this is clearly resonated with so many people is really telling, because it says a lot about, well, one, how much more common than we realize these experiences of estrangement within families and of needing to cut ties within families are, particularly when the relationship's a mother-child relationship, how difficult that is, and how much of a taboo it is still. I guess there's still this, there's images of, it conjures up images of parents being dumped in nursing homes and abandoned and that kind of thing, which is just, it prevents any kind of meaningful conversation from being able to happen. And you've written so honestly about your experiences with estrangement and with this incredibly difficult concept. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. So estrangement is defined as the process of actively distancing yourself. I saw it as an unforeseen consequence. There were so many that came out of my childhood, that because I find it hard to believe that my parents acted the way they did, knowing what the fallout would be. And that was sort of part of the concept of aftershocks, was that they behaved the way they did. There were these flow-on effects that went into adulthood for their children, and in a way that has come back around again to my mother, in the form of estrangement. So there's a saying by George Eliot that consequences are unpitying, and that was on my wall while I was writing. And it really is a theme of the book, that these events that happened when we were children, the way that we were disciplined and treated when we were kids 30, 40 years ago, those things were considered acceptable, or they were accepted by society at that time. But that's shifted in the time since. And now as adults, we look back on that time and we assess that, and we consider it quite differently. And while many parents think that a blood relation is permanent and involuntary, younger people are making a decision for their own well-being. They are deciding for themselves where their boundaries lie, and they're making that call for themselves based on self-care and kind of reaching their own limit of what they'll take. And I know I had a question earlier in the week from someone about the repeated nature of estrangement, how you can go in and out of it, and someone wanted me to talk a bit more about that. And that's quite a common pattern. There's a few myths around estrangement. One is that it happens suddenly, and it's been shown in research that that's not the case. People cycle in and out of contact. They will keep going back to the well. They will have a period of feeling like they can't deal with this person anymore, so they'll distance themselves, and then they're away a certain amount of time. Maybe it's Christmas or a birthday comes up or something, and they feel pressure, or they just miss the person, or they start to minimize the effect that person had on their life, and they'll go back. And that can happen many times over the course of a life, and some people will just continue to do that until one or other of them expires. But for people like me, my sister's death was kind of like a watershed, and I actually had this weird feeling that if I stayed in contact with my mother, that I was going to end up dead too. That was my biggest fear. It was irrational given the evidence, but that was the feeling, like, this is toxic, and I need to really look hard at what I'm doing here and what I'm engaging with. Some of the other myths around estrangement are that it's rare, as you mentioned, James. There's some research out of the UK. There's actually an organisation, if anyone else is struggling with this, it's called Stand Alone, and they have a website and they have a lot of resources. And I found that fascinating. There's a whole organisation dedicated to this phenomenon. But they did some research and they found that 1 in 5 people, sorry, there goes my earpiece, 1 in 5 people
problem with
in the
not
UK.
having wires anymore, isn't it? They fall out and that's it, they're gone.
My ear holes are too big. 1 in 5 people are estranged, and yeah, the other myth is that there's a clear reason for it happening, and it can be abuse, betrayal, poor parenting, but often they say there's a lot of overlap of those things, those effects. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's not something that I advocate, but it is an option if you are struggling, and you definitely, I think, need to be supported through it if you are considering it with therapy and professional help.
There's a scene in the book that jumped out at me again when I was reading it this time, where you were talking to a colleague, a journalist colleague, Bernard, about a threat, or I guess a flippant threat that your mother had made, that she was going to kill herself, which you had interpreted, I think based on the evidence given in the book, fairly accurately as something that she was not likely, to carry out. It was part of a pattern of behaviour of, coercive and abusive behaviour. But on relaying this to Bernard, he was outraged and panicked that, well, having thought that maybe she actually is going to kill herself, and, why aren't you kind of making you feel like a terrible daughter for not going and, flying over to New Zealand to check up on her? And that's kind of emblematic of what makes these conversations so difficult as a whole, because there is that societal expectation and understanding about, again, particularly relationships between parents and children, and how each person's meant to respond, and and in a more functional relationship that hadn't been marred by the kind of past and violence that yours had. Jumping on a plane to New Zealand would be a perfectly rational response, but it's very hard to explain that to someone who doesn't understand that. And I guess in turn to get the kind of support that you need to work through that. I think we've lost your audio, Michelle. That's all good. I'd sing to pass the time while Michelle's sorting out her audio, but I don't think anyone wants that. Still can't hear you, Michelle.
Still no. Maybe if you unconnect your Bluetooth and then you could maybe just go off your laptop.
Am I back?
Oh,
Yeah.
there you are.
Thank God. It's all right. Thank goodness. I touched them and they must have turned off. Sorry about that, guys. Where were we?
So we're talking about the conversation with Bernard in the book and how,
yeah. Oh, yes. Someone was reading the book and texting me as they were reading it. Someone who came from a very similar background, and her comment was, "Oh, Bernard."
Yeah.
Really, and that really sums it up, right? You either know or you don't.
Yes.
And he came from a very lovely, warm, loving background.
Yeah.
And he was the coroner of the town. And I think he probably had my best interests at heart. He didn't want me to feel any guilt or, for there to be anything bad happen, I guess. And so he was, encouraging me to go home and check on her. And of course, when I got home, it had been all a big ruse to get me home, to manipulate me. So, but I was young. I think I was 19 or 20, 21 maybe. And so at that age, you do think that older people know best, and that if any call that you make, is probably ill-informed and not hugely mature. And so when a man of 60 plus with many years as the town's coroner said, I think you should go back, I did. And yeah, in some ways it was a good learning exercise. I saw her for what she was doing, and I decided I'd never do that again. So you can't say you wish you never did things, because it all adds up to the story and the end outcome. Yeah.
What you said a moment ago about unforeseen consequences is fascinating, and this is not something that I'd thought much about until we were talking about it in emailing back and forth early this week. You said that you believe that your parents were oblivious to the harm they were doing. It raises questions about the differences between intentions and outcomes, and how much these nuances determine whether or not something is abuse. And I guess it's interesting, again, rereading the book this week. It's very, very easy for someone who's removed from it all from a distance to make judgments. But I was reading and I was thinking, this sounds a lot like abuse. It's really interesting that, but then I guess it's family, that the dynamics among families are so particular to them, and it's the kind of stuff that you can only know that dynamic if you were there, and you can only know, it's very easy to read a book and see people painted a certain way, or to read a certain part of the character, but you grew up with them, and obviously were, for every terrible experience there was something positive as well, and it makes it so much more complicated.
And I mean, it is a curated selection of stories in a sense, right? I can't give you everything. I've tried to give you a taste of people like my father, his humor, his practical jokes. I mean, we had a culture of him and I back and forth with practical jokes. That was something that we had. And he was an incredibly gregarious man. He was a party. He was a party on legs. He'd walk in and it was party time. He was great fun, and but I don't think I wanted to spend too much time on that, because the story was more serious than that. It went deeper than that, and a lot of that was surface stuff. A lot of that was the guy that the public saw, and to me the depth really was the stuff that the public didn't see. That was the stuff that was scarring, I guess. And for a long time I grieved him because I thought I'd lost, I had lost, my main male role model. I didn't know then that there were better role models, I guess. And he will always be an enigma to me. We were talking about this before we came on. I will never quite get my hands around exactly what he was. And that's okay with me. I've learned to accept that. That's just how it goes when you lose your parent young. You know, you never get to know them as an adult. So yeah, it was a tricky thing to do because it is a very dark story. But in my judgment, it needed to be, because people died. You know, I didn't want to spend too much time talking about how jokey the guy was, when the consequences of this family were that my siblings died. Both of them had extensive therapy for family issues. I have had extensive therapy for family issues. You know, it's probably only luck that I'm here still. That's something I've had to think about a lot over the years. Like, what's the difference between me and them? Why am I here and they're not? That's something I don't know the answer to. Some people have said it's just genetic. Some people are more resilient than others. But resilience is a tough thing to nail down too. So yeah, it's a story that still leaves questions for me. So it probably still leaves questions for the reader too.
I mean, you do such a wonderful job of, I guess it speaks to two near universal, well, certainly very common elements of domestic violence, which is the one you say, the front-facing, you know, what's projected to the public being so very different to what's actually happening inside the family home, but also how complicated your grief for him was. And you described that beautifully, because I found that to be one of the most affecting parts of the book, was the way you describe the complexity and the contradictions in your grief for your father, because that feels so real. You know, it's never black and white, is it? It's never two-dimensional. And I guess that must make you know, questions like unforeseen consequences and, you know, whether or not they were oblivious to the harm they were doing, all the more tormenting and all the more, you know, desperate to try to answer, because you've got these two very you know, disparate elements that don't marry together. And like you say, that you can't you know, get your hands on that. It's an enigma. Yeah,
it's just the definition of an enigma in my mind. He will just forever be sort of a loose set of descriptions. Yeah, he gave me a lot. Like he gave me a love of the outdoors. His sense of humor. He had a gregariousness about him that was a great model for me doing this sort of thing. You know, I wasn't so sheltered when I was brought up that I didn't see someone out there selling himself, being super cheeky and super friendly and all the rest of it. So yeah, there was that dad, and then there was the dad we saw in private. And it was it's interesting, isn't it? Because I felt, as I say in the book, that there were these two sides that I had to kind of try and marry up, and in the end I've just had to accept that there are these two guys. And you know, it makes a lot of sense in some ways, because if my mother has the type of personality disorder that I think she does, then the way he behaved was actually quite in keeping with that dynamic of that sort of marriage that produces. So in terms of him being an enabler and that sort of thing. So some of it can be explained and sort of put in a box, but the majority of it is just sort of out there in the ether, and I just have to put up with that. And that's okay. Yeah.
Have you spoken to other people about the concept of unforeseen circumstances, so consequences, who've had a similar reaction to me, where, like I said, that from an, you know, an outsider, obviously it's very, very easy to pass judgment without being involved. But you know, my response was
that it was not acceptable. And
it's hard, isn't it? Because it feels very presumptuous of me to say, you know, well, I've read your book and your mum and dad were abusive. Like, who the hell am I? I don't get to say that.
Well, I'll tell you a weird experience I had on one of the booksellers' websites. The book is categorized as domestic violence. It's categorized under domestic violence. And I just thought, oh, shit. Oh, that's not good. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about that, you know, the 30-40 year difference between what was accepted, not necessarily acceptable, but accepted by society, that we would smack, wash mouths out with soap, you know, all those hideous things that they used to do to kids. And we don't see that as accepted today. We see that as traumatizing, as abuse, basically. And it's that shift that's been made in that time that makes it, there's that, there's a break. And so, today, if you did those things and you said those things to a child, the outcome would be very, very different, you would hope.
I guess also the violence between your parents. There's a lot of instances in the book where you describe your father being very physically
but
abusive
also my
to your
mother.
mother.
My mother. Yeah. You know, and that's something people don't talk about. And
we lost Michelle again.
Oh, I think we've lost her. That's all right. If she drops off, she can just click the link. And
you know what? I'm gonna take this opportunity.
Oh no, there she is. Definition of abuse and of domestic abuse.
Sorry, we cut out again for a second there, Michelle. You're back.
No, that's okay. My internet connection is unstable. That's fairly normal around here. So I think my definition, and maybe many people's definition of domestic violence, is man on woman, woman cowering in the corner. But my experience of it was combative, both parties. I know some scenes in the book are man on woman, but there was a lot of occasions where it was just fighting, just like street brawling. So, you know, when you've got a couple of Spitfires in the same house, it ends up just being an all-in type of thing. So it gets hard to define, you know, where the blame lies and where the line is and all that sort of stuff. And in the meantime, there's these three kids just watching on. It doesn't really matter.
Well, exactly. They don't. And it's well, I feel very presumptuous to say something like it reads like abuse to me, because you know, I can't imagine the complexity of knowing as well that you love these people in some way, on some level. You know, how do you then how do you justify that to, or you shouldn't have to justify that to people who are, you know, it's the beauty of your book is that you've captured the complexity of all that so well, that it's not, and because it's told in this fragmented nature, you know, the chapters are a couple hundred words, a couple of thousand words each. You get this wonderful sort of mosaic effect of, it's like a glass is shattered and this is what's left, which again speaks to the earthquake metaphor and how well that works. But you know, you can't make sense of that. You can't.
No, and that was what I was shooting for. Was I didn't want it to be tidy, and I didn't want it to be wrapped up neat in a bow, because life isn't that, and the lived experience certainly wasn't that. And you know, that again is evidenced by my brother and sister passing away. So yeah, there was definitely that. I'm glad that you said that, because that was something I was trying to get across. Was that this is a deeply complex story, and I don't want you to come away thinking that you necessarily understand it, because I don't think anybody does. You know, I don't think the main players understood it. There's a story about my father going to my grandmother's house, his mother, that my uncle told me once, and he said that he used to go there, put his head in his hands and say, I don't know what to do about her. And, you know, I have so much compassion for him in that moment, because he must have been under enormous pressure to behave and to say those things. So, you know, there's an adult story here that as the child of that union, I was not privy to. So I can only try and understand it from my very limited perspective.
And I think, again, you know, you do such a beautiful job of not passing blame and of writing with such compassion. Maybe it speaks to that I'm too emotional and too quick to anger, that there are a lot of parts of the book where you know, I wanted to leap into the pages and rescue whoever it was at that particular moment that was being subjected to whatever was happening.
Me too,
Yeah.
James. Yeah.
But you write, yeah, with such compassion, and
I think that was really important to me to be as hard on myself in the book as I was on everyone else, because a story like that, it's too easy to just stand back and point the finger and say that, you know, you're the reason I'm here right now, and this is you're the reason everything fell apart. And I didn't want to do that. I've been a player in this. I have had my role all the way through. I've made my choices, and I wanted to own those. And I also wanted to show, you know, my cowardice at times. Like I've never been a supremely brave person, so I wanted to fess up to that stuff as well. You know, like I wasn't terribly honourable after my sister died, when I could have gone and helped dress the body and that sort of thing. I wanted to own that. So yeah, it's writing a memoir is hugely challenging on that level. It's really makes you step back and study your own motives and your own motivations. So I think as a result, I know myself a lot better, which is, you know, one good thing to come out of it.
I guess as well, the advantage or the benefit of not writing simplistically and assigning blame and making the bad guys and the good guys, and is that in the ambiguity, in the moral ambiguity that's left, you can start to see some of the deeper underlying factors. And they're things, like you've said, like epigenetics, mental illness, you know, cycles of abuse and mental illness and, you know, alcoholism. And there's all these things that you kind of lose if there's a bad guy and a good guy, and, you know, they're an awful person. That's why all this stuff happened. That is really apparent, again, to continue the metaphor, in the cracks between these episodes. You know, no one's wholly at fault.
Never. No one's wholly good and no one's wholly bad.
You could write this story very briefly and very simply and very black and whitely, and you'd sort of gain nothing from it. I think, but it's, and I guess that on some level, this would be the experience of all families, or most families, you know, to a very different degree. And I think that in itself is really beneficial to think about and to explore, you know, regardless of whether the kind of family dynamics are the kind that you experience growing up and to the extreme that you experience growing up. Those interplays and those complexities are in every family. And
it's growing, you know, you're sort of hoping to grow the reader's empathy for other experiences, and not to assume that just because someone looks like they've got their shit together that they actually do, you know, or that they've had it easy, or any of that stuff, or the person that you walk past in the supermarket who, you know, is in your way or something like that you can't. That was one other thing that I actually had in mind when I was writing, was this idea of aftershocks and you know, unforeseen consequences, that this idea that, you know, we can apply this to our everyday life. You know, you don't know what the other person is going through, whether you honk at them in the street or, you know, whatever. That you to be more aware of how our actions domino into other people's experience of living. And my sister was in my mind there because of the family secret, which dogged her whole adult, her whole from when she was about 11, and how that just sort of impacted her so badly as an adult, and in all her relationships and her mental health and all of that. And I just sort of thought, if I could write something that would make people see how this one thing she was told when she was so young just rippled through her whole life. Like, if people could just see how big of an impact that had, maybe there's a chance people might go, well, maybe I'll just, you know, hold my tongue in certain scenarios, and we could all be just that little bit kinder if we were aware of what we were saying or doing, what that meant for the other person further down the track. So that was a big thing in my brain in terms of aftershocks as well. So yeah,
I guess
it's a big ask. But
we're talking about aftershocks in a, with solely negative connotations, but it doesn't have to be that way. And something that you said to Ashley and I when we spoke in August was that the thing that drove you to write this book more than anything else was to leave a legacy for your brother and sister, and to give their lives and their deaths, I guess, a meaning that they perhaps lacked at the time. And I'm not even going to frame this as a question, because I know it has. I know that hearing you talk tonight, and again seeing the interactions you've had with people on social media and having spoken to you since the book's come out, that the people that it's touched and the people who've taken so much from you sharing your story, that you've achieved that.
oh, thanks, James. That means a lot. Yeah, that one of the main driver when things were rough was honoring them and giving their story some life, I suppose, because they both died fairly young, and they both died tragically, and they were more or less forgotten by the world. And I didn't want that to be the case. And I thought if they died and it was for nothing, that would be a huge loss. And they were both such good people. They were good, kind, empathic people. Especially my brother. He was just the softest marshmallow. And if I could make something that honored their short lives, then that would be, that would be winning. And then to have the offer of publication, it was just the icing on the top. So, all of this is just a dream for me and for them. Yeah.
Michelle, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you tonight, and to talk to you again, and I feel like we've closed the loop in our conversation now that started in August. Before I throw over to Jana to see if she wants...
I think we're related now, James, aren't we?
More or less, yeah. I had one more question. We've barely touched on the earthquake stuff tonight. We've been talking about the family element of your book. True. You lived through the 2011 Christchurch earthquake. You moved to Melbourne to get away from earthquakes, and they followed you there.
I know what you're going to ask.
Yeah, because about was it 2 weeks ago now, Melbourne had a not insignificant earthquake, and I know that I'm not the only person whose first thought was, "Oh shit, Michelle." It was the first thing I thought. Was this poor woman has crossed oceans, has moved to a different country to get away from earthquakes, and here we are. So you're obviously in Melbourne on the day that happened. What was your experience of it?
Well, I can't run anywhere because it's locked down, so I was kind of stuck here. I was in bed, should have been up earlier that day, obviously, and I heard the noise, and it was so familiar, and the wall started to crack. And
did you have structural damage at your place?
Those cracks I talked about in the floor of my kitchen in the book? Yeah, they've opened up. I don't know what that does for my metaphor, but anyway.
Where doesn't get earthquakes? Where?
Yeah,
I would have said Melbourne 2 weeks ago.
I've given up. I just have to put up with it now. Yeah, no, I just lay there, and I've never frozen in my life. I've always run, and this time I just froze, and I thought, no, no way. This is a flashback. I'm having a flashback or something, because I did have those for a while. And my husband was on a Zoom call with noise cancelling headphones on, and I was screaming for him from the bed, lying flat on my back, just rigid, screaming his name. And he couldn't hear me, but everyone on his work meeting could hear me. And finally, I don't know, someone said something, or he heard me, but he came running, and the phone rang. It was my daughter who lives in Melbourne, and we both just sobbed, and it was horrible.
Was she in Christchurch as well, your daughter?
No, she's here. She's in Melbourne.
No, but sorry, for the 2011 earthquake.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
that same one, yes. And yeah, we just sobbed. It was the ugly cry. It was awful. And then I realized, by about lunchtime, we weren't going to get aftershocks like we did in Christchurch. Thank God. That would have been the pits. That would have just done my head in, I think. So if it was a one and done, all right, that I can deal with that. Yeah.
So 10,001 aftershocks now. Let's just
yeah.
park it at that. Yeah.
I have to go around and change all the covers and all the books.
It's an extra chapter.
Yeah, hang about. We're not done yet. So, yeah, I don't know. We're going to have to make a claim for the floor. And but yeah, I guess I was being tested again. It was interesting.
It is unbelievable. Yeah.
Oh, I know.
It's incredible.
Overall, I'm pretty happy with how I held together. But yeah, just unbelievable. I think it's my fault, actually, James. I think they.
I mean, you are the common factor. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a few people said they felt it in Dubbo where I was, but the dog didn't even wake up. So I don't know. I think maybe they're just jumping on the bandwagon. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I have to say thank you to all the people who sent me messages. My phone just lit up like a Christmas tree and just kept going.
Why I waited till 4 o'clock to message, because I knew I'd get lost on the onslaught.
It was amazing. Yeah, people were so lovely. And I was saying, are you okay? And they're like, oh yeah, we're fine. We'll just worry about you. Because they didn't have that whole history.
Yes.
And after a couple of hours, I kind of realized that was why they were okay and I wasn't.
Well, I imagine it'd be a novelty for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's a definite feeling.
Because they've not lived through something like you have, where people died. 150 people died.
Yeah,
it's very easy to be like, to go out and take pictures, and if you've not had that trauma. Yeah. And
I was so proud that I said it's a 5 and it came in at a 5.9, so I have not lost my touch.
Yeah. Did Greg make a guess?
No, he did not, because he didn't feel it, I don't think, because he was all,
yeah,
had his headphones on and yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad to end on a more uplifting note. Michelle,
Yes.
Thank you so much for having this conversation, for inviting me to chat with you again. It's been such a pleasure, such a delight. If anyone who's here has not read 10,000 Aftershocks, go and read it, get a copy of it. Like I said at the outset, I'm so lucky that I get books arriving on my door every other day, but this one was something very special, and I knew as soon as I read it that it was going to be received, with as enthusiastically as it has been. And I'm so excited and so privileged to be, peripherally in some small way a part of the book, come into the world, not just once now, but twice. So thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you, James, and good luck for your book.
Thank you.
Can't wait.
I will go to the Q&A. We do have some questions coming in, and I will try and get through as many as I can. We will start off with a question from Cass. And Michelle, Cass wants to know, what was the particular tipping point that allowed you to give yourself permission to make the story public? And was that decision a kind of relief, or was it frightening to be so open?
Cass, it was terrifying. I have to tell you, it was terrifying until the day the book came out. I don't think there's anything quite like publishing a memoir, and when it's your debut, it's just that added layer of not knowing what's going to happen next. Yeah, the tipping point for giving myself permission. I don't know that there was one. I think it was a gradual process. I think I started writing it with the idea of honoring my brother and sister and just seeing what I could do. And then I started to have some success. I had a chapter placed in a competition that was published, and that was a big moment. Like, oh, is this going to be difficult? Is this going to have some backlash from family or whatever? And then it didn't. So it was gradual, I would say. And I think it comes down to making the choice between, James and I actually just briefly touched on this before we came on, about weighing up the value of the relationships that you're risking by publishing versus the need and the want that you have to tell your own story and to claim your voice. And in my case, I had been quiet for my whole life. I had just shut up and sat down and been a good girl. And really, a lot of my family was dead. I'm estranged from my mother. I don't have a lot of relationships left to lose in that regard. So it wasn't as difficult as it might be for some people. So that, if that's any help, if that's something you're doing, then that's what it comes down to. You're weighing those two things up.
And was there a moment of relief at all in the process of this?
Relief. I think when the book came out and it was well received, I think that's just a huge relief. Yeah. Getting a couple of good reviews was really nice.
Rebecca wants to know, I wondered if Michelle found that she began to see her other relationships, for example, your partner, children and friends, differently after writing your memoir.
I think I already had. I think that was part of the journey to writing the memoir, not the other way around. It's quite something to be loved unconditionally when you've been loved conditionally as a child, and that was something that I recognized early on in my marriage. It's my second marriage, obviously, so I know I knew what I was looking at when I was on the receiving end of unconditional love. And my children, definitely, again, I'd probably come to those sorts of conclusions before I started writing it, because I kind of always said I took my experience of childhood and I wanted to do a complete 180 and go the other way and try and give more unconditional love, be more patient and that sort of thing. Obviously, I don't get it right all the time, but I often said that my childhood was the template I did not want to follow. I would do the opposite of that. So, yeah.
Melissa says, you've talked about the structure of the book. I'd love to hear about how you arrived at the decision to adopt the second person point of view briefly late in the book.
Yes. So that was actually a result of attending the hard copy program. So that was a manuscript development program run by the ACT Writers Centre. And there was a session run by Nadine Davidoff, who's a wonderful editor here in Melbourne. And we discussed the second person as part of one of her sessions. And she gave an example of someone who was writing about a very privileged life, and they wrote in the second person. And the explanation given was that the person who the story was about didn't want, if she'd written in the first person, would have sounded kind of arrogant and self-centered if she described her own, like, nice house, nice car, beautiful children, all the rest of it. If she'd said that about herself, that would have come off as kind of big-headed. So I sort of applied the same principle when I was writing that piece about, you weren't the scapegoat, you weren't told this, you weren't badly treated, you were the special one. If I'd said I was the special one, that sort of same tone might come in, that I sounded a bit sort of arrogant. So that was the main reason, that when Nadine said that, I was like, oh yes, okay, that sounds like something I should be doing there. The other one, there was another second person piece too. I can't remember what it is. I can't remember off the top of my head now, but it might have been something similar. Yeah. Sorry, I can't remember.
That's all right. Jody says, I'd like to know a bit about the process of writing the book in fragments. Was that how the project evolved? And then they also say, I know you submitted, you mentioned also the chapter that you submitted that also won. How much more of the book?
Second. Yeah, sorry. Just don't want to take it away from the winner.
How much more of the book was drafted by then? And did you kind of have a fixed idea of the outcome, or did it evolve?
It definitely evolved. It was quite an organic process. So I started out trying to write your regular memoir, chronological, linear. It would have been probably 3 volumes long if I'd kept that up. It just didn't work. I had an editor look at it early on. They said, nah, it's really not, it's not falling into place for you. And I've joked around about this with James and Ashley, actually. I was reading Memoir Writing for Dummies, and in there was this option of writing in fragments, and it gave the example of a couple of US books. So I got a hold of them, I read them, loved them, and thought, yes, this is definitely something I could do. So I started writing. That was one part of it. Then I ended up at Verona, and I met my friend Amanda Webster, and we were talking about my story, and I told her about the earthquakes and my family, and we were out on a hike one day, and she said, sounds like your father's death was like an earthquake in your family. And that just sort of really struck me, as that was the first time those two things had come together, those two ideas had come together in someone's head. Wasn't in my head. And it took me a couple of months to really, sit with that and figure out what I could do with it. And then I just started to combine those two ideas, the two topics and the fragments, and I started working. I entered that chapter in the competition because it was one of the longer chapters that I had. It did really well. That was great. So I went back to the manuscript and finished it, took it to the hard copy program, and Pip McGuinness, I've said this a few times, I said to her, I don't know if you'll like this fragmented style. And she said, no, it's good. You just need to push the seismic aspect a bit harder. So that's when I overlaid the 5 stages of the earthquake. I came home and I found that in a note I had somewhere, and it jumped out at me as being just the obvious thing to do. Was that all the questions there?
I think so. I think you going through that just really backs up just what James was saying, that this book is a masterclass in structure. We've got another question from Tabitha that says, I'd love to know what you're writing next.
I know who this is. Hi, Tabitha. I am working on a historical novel. It's based on a true crime. It's set in 1860s Tasmania, Victoria, and New Zealand. And it's a feminist novel, and I'm loving it. So yeah, hopefully it'll keep going well.
Great. And then we'll end on a question from Lorraine. And Lorraine actually said that she works in Child Protective Services, and she recommends your book to everyone that she meets. And she says,
Aww.
How do you remain so kind with all that has happened in your life?
Am I though? I think that going through crap makes you more compassionate and makes you value life. And I think that really is the ultimate upside to all of this, really. Yeah. That's the short answer to that one.
Yeah, we actually just had one more question come in from Ashley. She says, Michelle, what do you feel are good companion reads to your book?
Oh, Ashley, that's a really hard question. In terms of structure, The Chronology of Water, I love, and The Other Side by Lacey M. Johnson. I can thoroughly recommend those two. Oh, and Nick Flynn wrote 2 memoirs. One has the best title ever, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. That's a really good one. And The Ticking is the Bomb. That's also a wonderful book. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just going to pop the link as well back in the chat of where you can purchase 10,000 Aftershocks. This has been a very incredible conversation. I'm so glad that I was able to host tonight. James, do you have any finishing words?
Just that, Michelle, I'm really sorry that the questions I spent 45 minutes asking were so much worse than those audience questions. They were so good. Thinking, shit, why didn't I think of that?
Well, I should have had Ashley, that's the problem here.
Yeah, exactly. Apparently she's the glue that holds these conversations together, apparently. Except when she's throwing in curveballs about, companion reads and putting you on the spot.
No, you're lovely. Thank you, James. I really appreciate this very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on Zoom tonight. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was the last conversation to wrap up your tour.
Yeah, it really is. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I can't actually see everyone, but it's lovely to have you here. Oh, I'm just scrolling through now. Oh yes, I know a lot of those names. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's lovely to have you here.
Congratulations, Michelle, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, Yana. Bye.
See you later.